Pokemon Champions has recently released a new regulation called Regulation MB, bringing in several new Mega Evolutions and a few old Megas that weren't available at launch, along with a few other strong Pokemon from past games. While most people are excited to try out the brand new Megas, I had my eyes on two older Megas that I've been wanting to use. The first one being Mega Mawile. It's one of my favorite Mega Evolutions of all time, so I was very disappointed to see that wasn't available at launch. Now that it's finally here, I'm very excited to use it. Mega Mawile is a very strong Pokemon thanks to its ability Huge Power, which doubles its attack stat, effectively giving it the highest attack stat in the game. It also has some strong base abilities in Intimidate to lower opponent's attack, and Hyper Cutter to prevent its own attack from being lowered. Originally, I had tested Mawile in a solo Mega team to try and get a feel for it, and I think I found a good duo to pair with it, that being Mega Swampert. Mega Swampert was actually one of the first Mega Evolutions I ever used back in Pokemon Omega Ruby, so I was happy to see it return in this regulation. It covers both of Mawile's weaknesses being fire and ground types, and its ability Swift Swim doubles its speed and rain, enabling me to play both in Trick Room with Mawile and out of Trick Room with Swampert. Swampert also received a nice buff with it gaining access to Wave Crash. This gives it a powerful 120 base power water type attack, which is significantly higher compared to moves like Waterfall and Liquidation being only 80 and 85 base power respectively. As for the rest of my team, I chose Farigiraf as my Trick Room setter. Thanks to its high HP stat, Farigiraf is quite bulky despite its bad defensive stats. This, along with the ability Armor Tail, which blocks our priority moves, lets it reliably set up Trick Room. For rain support, I opted for Pelipper. It's able to set up rain upon switching in with its ability Drizzle, and it gets access to Tailwind, giving the team another form of speed control. This helps Mega Swampert outspeed opposing Tailwind or Swift Swim users. To pair that, I'll be adding Archaludon. Is another Pokemon that can take advantage of the rain with its signature move Electroshot. This move boosts Archaludon's special attack by 1 stage every time it's used, and it becomes a single turn move in rain as opposed to it taking 2 turns in normal conditions. And finally, to round out the team, I added Incineroar. It provides valuable support through Fake Out, Intimidate, and Pardon Shot, helping create opportunities for the rest of the team. Now I'll be honest, I'm still fairly new to VGC, as I've only really been playing since the launch of Champions. Because of that, this team is probably flawed. So let me know what you think. Are there any improvements you make? But enough of that, let's get into some games. Okay, before the actual gameplay starts, here's the replica team ID, their movesets, and stats. As I said in the intro, this team isn't perfect. There may be better movesets or stat spreads, however, this is a team I made, so feel free to use it or modify it however you want. Alright, so in this first game, I'm up against another Swampert team. So I decided to leave Pelipper behind because my Swampert isn't max speed. So assuming he's max speed, I'd actually be faster in Trick Room. So we see here he leads Swampert plus Sableye. Now my first thought is that he's going to use Rain Death on Sableye. So I go ahead and use Trick Room as planned. And I decide to protect Swampert so that I don't take any unnecessary damage before I could set up my Trick Room. So he does go ahead and Mega Evolve. And now Sableye actually goes for Reflect instead of Rain Dancing. And then we see their Swampert targets into Farigiraf with Wave Crash, however we live the hit and are able to set up Trick Room. This however means that Swampert protecting was actually kinda useless. But I wanted to play it safe so it's not that big of a deal. Now I go ahead and Wave Crash into their Swampert, while I switch out Farigiraf for Incineroar to drop their attack. We see that they don't make any switch-ins as my Mega goes off. And now we see that Sableye actually goes for Rain Dance, which will boost my Wave Crash damage, helping me out instead of them. And we pick up the KO through Reflect thanks to their Rain. Now we see that they send out Pelipper, which can actually threaten a KO into Swampert after another instance of Wave Crash recoil, assuming that they are max special attack. so I decide to go for some damage into Sableye as I fake out into Pelipper to prevent it from moving. Fake out successfully goes into Pelipper. However, Sableye encores into my swampert, forcing me to continue using Wave Crash. Due to the Reflect, Sableye is able to lift this Wave Crash from Swampert. Now my Swampert is in danger of being KO'd, and because of the Encore from earlier, I am unable to protect. So after some debating, I decide to switch him out for Farigiraf. As for Incineroar, I decide to Darkest Lariat into Sableye to finish it off. Sableye decides to go for Light Screen before getting taken out by Incineroar. Pelipper actually targets it into Incineroar with Thunder Ball. However, I lived a hit, meaning I'm now up 4-2 in terms of how many Pokemon we have left. And then Incineroar recovers HP with his Citrus Berry, leaving me at decent health. And they send out Gholdengo as their final Pokemon. Trick Room is still up, so I decide to go for some damage with both my Pokemon. Farigiraf moves first and Twin Beam goes into Pelipper, and I get a lucky critical hit. Next goes Incineroar, which launches the Darkest Lariat into Gholdengo, leaving it at half health. And Pelipper uses Hurricane into Incineroar, which actually leaves it alive. Gholdengo decides to Nasty Plot, meaning both my Pokemon survive this turn. However, Trick Room is now over, meaning my speed control is lost. Rain also ends this turn, meaning it would have been preferable for my Incineroar to get knocked out, so that my Swampert could get a free switch in while Rain is still active. After some debating, I decide to protect Farigiraf and attack with Incineroar. However, because Trick Room is now over, that means Gholdengo moves first and finishes off Incineroar with Make It Rain before it can move. And we find out that Gholdengo's item is Life Orb. And Hurricane is blocked by Protect, so Farigiraf survives this turn. However, as mentioned earlier, Rain has ended this turn, meaning Swampert may not outspeed Gholdengo. I think about whether I should Trick Room or Twin Beam, but I decide to Twin Beam into Pelipper. As for Swampert, I decide to go for the tag, hoping that I outspeed Gholdengo. Unfortunately, Gholdengo is faster and Shadow Balls into Swampert, KOing it. Pelipper goes for the Hurricane, however Farigiraf just barely manages to hold on and goes for the Twin Beam. I get another lucky crit, putting Pelipper into range of another attack. Now we are both down to our last two Pokemon, however I still have the health advantage. I decide to protect Farigiraf. As for Archaludon, I was unsure if Dracometer would pick up the kill, however, I had to go for it anyway. Gholdengo launches a Shadow Ball into Archaludon, which is actually a critical hit, however it still manages to lift the hit. Draco Meteor connects with Gholdengo and finishes it off. As for Pelipper, it goes for Tailwind, which may have been a misplay, as it is faster than my Farigiraf already, so finishing off Archaludon would have been a better move. At this point, I just need to double target into Pelipper and the game is basically over. And although it didn't really matter, Pelipper misses Hurricane into Farigiraf. And then Draco Meteor finishes off Pelipper, winning me the game. Alright, now we're up against what seems to be a Mega Aerodactyl team, and I choose to go with Mawile for this one. We see here that they lead Garchomp and Kingambit, which is not ideal for me as I led Mawile. Having Intimidate means that I activate the opposing Kingambit's Defiant, giving it an attack boost. I decide to go for the Trick Room regardless, and protect on my Mawile to keep me safe from any ground type attacks from Garchomp. My Protect does go off, however, Garchomp actually goes for Rock Slide here, instead of a ground type move into my Mawile. It does little damage into Farigiraf, and we find out that it is Life Orb. As for Kingambit, it attacks into Farigiraf, however thanks to the Cobra Berry, it manages to lift ahead. But unfortunately, Farigiraf flinches, meaning I can't set up Trick Room. Initially, I decide to switch up Farigiraf for Pelipper. However, I decide to use Protect on it instead. As for Mawile, I end up just going for our Swords Dance, hoping that Garchomp will just continue to use Rock Slide. Luckily, Garchomp does go for another Rock Slide, doing little damage to Mawile. Kingambit goes for Caltalk Leaf into Farigiraf, however it is blocked by Protect. We also find out that it is faster than Mawile. At this point I do decide to preserve my Farigiraf by switching it out for Pelipper. But I do make a mistake here as I calculate that a full HP Garchomp could survive a hit from a +2 Sucker Punch from Mawile. However, I forgot to take into account that it already took Life Orb recoil damage, so I would have picked up the KO if I had gone for it. This mistake caused me to attack into a protected Kingambit and having to take an Earthquake from Garchomp. Because of the Intimidate, I don't take too much damage. However, this turn could have gone way better for me. I go for a Weather Ball into Kingambit with Pelipper, and this time I do Sucker Punch to Garchomp. Sucker Punch manages to pick up the KO onto Garchomp, and I take damage from Rough Skin in return. Pelipper follows up with the Weather Ball, dealing decent damage into Kingambit. Meanwhile, Kingambit goes for Pelipper instead of finishing off Mawile, leaving me at my Focus Sash. And the opponent decides to send in Aerodactyl to replace Garchomp. I go for Tailwind on Pelipper, hoping to dodge the incoming Rock Slide. And I decide to protect Mawile this turn. The opponent goes ahead and Mega Evolve their Aerodactyl. and they decide to protect their King Gambit. The opponent actually uses Tailwind instead of attacking, most likely anticipating a Sucker Punch. And then my Tailwind goes off, equalizing the speed. I decide to go ahead and attack with Pelipper, hoping to get a hit in before it gets knocked out. As for Mawile, I'll go for a Sucker Punch into Aerodactyl. And the opponent actually switches out their King Gambit for Delayed, meaning I may get off some free damage into it. My Sucker Punch does connect into Aerodactyl, OHKOing it. And Weather Ball goes into Delayed, doing some good damage. Now the opponent is forced to bring back out King Gambit as it's their last Pokemon. At this point, I decide to attack with Pelipper. However, I decided to protect my Mawile. Initially, I was gonna attack the opposing Gallade. However, I feared that it may protect itself, so I went for this instead. Unfortunately, my worries were unnecessary, as Gallade does not go for Protect and instead goes for the finishing move on Pelipper. However, this was the safer play to me. I decide to switch in Farigiraf to prevent the opposing King Gambit from using Sucker Punch. I decide to attack into Gallade with Farigiraf. And then I'll attack into King Gambit with Mawile. I was worried about Playgraph missing, however I decided to go for it anyway. King Gambit does go for Sucker Punch, however I was blocked by Armor Tail. And then Gallade finishes off Farigiraf with Night Slash. Playgraph does connect, finishing off their King Gambit, leaving it a 2v1. I send in my final Pokemon Incineroar, and at this point the game is over as I have Fake Out Pressure on, and I have Sucker Punch for priority. So the opponent proceeds to forfeit, winning me the match. Now for this third game, we're up against what seems to be a Mega Staraptor and Mega Delphox team. I decide to bring Mawile, as it has a super effective move on both their Megas. They lead King Gambit and Grimmsnarl. Like last game, I am giving them a Defiant boost. I decide to set up Trick Room and go for a Swords Dance. Grimmsnarl removes hers and sets up a Reflect. King Gambit goes next, launching a Katak Leaf into Farigiraf. However, after the Global Barrier, Farigiraf manages to hold on. Next, Mawile successfully gets off a Swords Dance. I decide to attack both with Hyper Voice, and attack into King Gambit with Mawile. Unfortunately, King Gambit goes for Protect, blocking my play rough. Meanwhile, Hyper Voice does a good chunk into Grimmsnarl, which retaliates with Spirit Break. However, Farigiraf manages to hold on 1 HP. I decide to go for another Hyper Voice and play rough into King Gambit again. They do switch out their Grimmsnarl in favor of Staraptor, which will drop my attack with his Intimidate. Play rough goes into King Gambit, however it's not enough to KO. Farigiraf uses Hyper Voice, dealing decent damage to both Pokemon. And King Gambit finishes off Farigiraf. And I decide to switch in Pelipper to replace it. I decide to go for Hurricane into Staraptor, and then try to finish off Kingambit with Play Rough. The opponent actually double backs and switches out Staraptor, bringing Grimmsnarl back in. And Kingambit protects again, blocking my Play Rough. And Hurricane goes into Grimmsnarl. I decide to go for Weather Ball into Grimmsnarl and attack Kingambit again. Grimmsnarl takes this opportunity to set up Light Screen. And Kingambit launches a Sucker Punch into Mawile to deal some damage before getting finished off. And Play Rough connects, bringing down Kingambit. And Weather Ball goes into Grimmsnarl, finishing it off. However, the opponent managed to stall out my Trick Room. The opponent sends out Whimsicott and Staraptor as their final two Pokemon. I receive another Intimidate drop, meaning that Mawile is back to neutral attack. I decide to go for Hurricane into Staraptor, and switch out Mawile for Incineroar. Intimidate drops Staraptor's attack before it can Mega Evolve. The opponent goes for a Self-Charm to raise their Staraptor's attack by 2 stages. And they launch a Close Combat into Incineroar, killing it. Staraptor also receives a defense boost from Contrary Close Combat. Hurricane goes into Staraptor, however due to Light Screen and the special defense boost, it doesn't KO. I bring back in Mawile as my last Pokemon. Initially, I was gonna Hurricane into Staraptor, however I decide to Hurricane into Whimsicott instead and attack Staraptor with Mawile. The opponent uses Charm into my Mawile, dropping my attack by 2 stages. And Staraptor goes for Roost, healing its health. Hurricane launches into Whimsicott, however it lives to hit. And Play Rough connects into Staraptor. Despite the attack drops and Reflect, it still does massive damage. I decide to Hurricane into Whimsicott again to finish it off. I decide to Swords Dance and Mawile, hoping to get my attack back up. Whimsicott launches a Moonblast into Pelipper, dealing massive damage. And Staraptor close combats into Mawile, picking up a KO. And Pelipper finishes off Whimsicott with Hurricane. However, at this point the game is basically over. My Pelipper is slower than the opposing Staraptor, and Rain is now over. Although I lost this game, it shows how much damage Mawile really does even through Reflect and attack drops. If I had played a bit smarter, this game may have gone differently. In this 4th game, I'm up against another Mega Swampert team. However, I decided to bring Mega Mawile instead to see what it can do. The opponent leads Swampert and Basculegion, while I send out Farigiraf and Mawile. And Intimidate drops both their attack stats. I decide to take this opportunity to set up Trick Room, and I switch out Mawile for Incineroar to get another Intimidate out. I dropped the opponent's attack by another stage, and the Swampert proceeds to Mega Evolve. And Basculegion goes for Protect, while Swampert goes for the Earthquake. However, after 2 attack drops, it does minimal damage. Meanwhile, my Farigiraf manages to get off the trip then. I decide to Hyper Voice to get some damage into Swampert. And then I follow up with a Parting Shot also into Swampert. My opponent tries to Aqua Jet my Incineroar, however Armor Tail blocks it. And then Hyper Voice goes off, dealing decent damage to Swampert. Incineroar follows up with Parting Shot, lowering Swampert's attack even more. And then Mawile comes in, intimidating again. And Swampert goes for a Wave Crash into Farigiraf. However, after all the attack drops, it barely does anything. At this point, I go for another Hyper Voice, and decide to have a free chance to Swords Dance. The opponent chooses to switch out Swampert, and they bring out Sableye to replace it. Swords Dance goes off first, and I get my attack boost. And unfortunately, both the Pokemon on the field are Ghost types, so Hyper Voice does nothing this turn. As for Basculegion, it uses Wave Crash into Farigiraf. I decide to switch out Farigiraf for Incineroar to get another Intimidate off. And then I play rough into Sableye with Mawile. Basculegion does switch out here, so Intimidate doesn't really do much. And to replace it comes out Sneasler. Sableye uses this opportunity to set up Reflect. Player connects into Sableye, taking it out. And the opponent chooses to bring back out Basculegion to replace it. I decide to fake out the Sneasler and play off the Basculegion. The Basculegion goes for Protect, blocking my attacks. And Sneasler actually also protects, meaning neither of my Pokemon did damage this turn. This was my last turn of Trick Room, so the opponent was likely stalling it out. I decide to switch out Incineroar for Archaludon. I don't think I'll be needing it in this game, so I'm comfortable sacking it. As for Mawile, I decide to Sucker Punch into Basculegion. Basculegion goes for an Aqua Jet into Mawile. Although this doesn't do much damage, it denies my Sucker Punch. And then Sneasler close combats into my Archaludon. However, it actually lives. I would have actually preferred for it to get knocked out so I could have a free switching back into Incineroar. I get my stamina boost, although that doesn't really matter. And Sneasler procs his Wither, which activates Unburden. Although I likely won't have the chance to move, I decide to might as well go for the attack with Archaludon. And I protect Mawile so I can freely switch in Incineroar the next turn after Archaludon gets knocked out. And much to my surprise, Archaludon actually leaves the Aqua Jet, meaning it actually gets to attack this turn. As Sneasler went for close combat into Mawile, which was blocked by Protect. Draco Meteor connects into Sneasler, leaving at very low health. I decide to attack and try to finish off Sneasler with Archaludon, and attack into Basculegion with Mawile. Basculegion goes for a Protect, blocking my attack from Mawile. And Sneasler finishes off Archaludon. And Mawile attacks into a Protect again. I decide to switch in Incineroar to replace Archaludon. Once again, Intimidate drops my opponent's attack stats. And here I actually try to predict a double protect again, so I double back into Farigiraf so I could fake out the next turn. As for Mawile, I go for another attack into Basculegion. Armor Trail blocks the Aqua Jet from coming out. However, Sneasler doesn't protect me and instead plus combos into Farigiraf, finishing it off. Now my Mawile finally gets to attack into Basculegion, taking it out. And I send in my last Pokemon Incineroar to replace Farigiraf, while the opponent sends out their last Pokemon, Mega Swampert. Intimidate activates for the final time this battle, lowering the opponent's attack stats. I decide to fake out into Swampert, and set up another Sword Dance on Mawile so I can guarantee a KO through Reflect. The Swampert doesn't protect and fake out goes out. The Sneasler close combos into Incineroar, however after attack drops it manages to live, and then it recovers health from its Citrus Berry. Swampert flinches from the fake out, and Mawile sets up another Sword Dance. Now I go for an attack into Sneasler, and Sucker Punch into Swampert. Sneasler chooses to protect, blocking any incoming damage. And Sucker Punch goes out into Swampert, KOing it. Although Sneasler lives this turn, the game is basically over and the opponent forfeits.